I'm calling to order this session of the King George County Service Authority Board of Directors.
This conference will now be recorded.
You ready now? All right, I'm calling to order this session of the King George County Service Authority Board of Directors budget work session. Do we have anybody here for public comment? Mr. Dines, is there anyone online? All right, moving on. Kyle with Davenport is going to go over our multi-year financial plan update.
Good, Mr. Chair and members of the is that on? There we go. Members of the Service Authority Board and other citizens. So knowing that it is budget season and there's a lot of different topics right now, and you're kind of digging into what I'll call the nitty-gritty of the budget in terms of individual line items, et cetera. Yeah. What Chris and Don and others asked me to do was to come back and give maybe just a refresher on the multi-year financial plan that the authority put in place, really beginning back in 2019. And somehow those years have gone by quickly. But that is a plan that's been in place. It's been working, at least from a financial perspective. And so thought maybe we would just rehash that, give a little refresher, a little perspective as you're thinking about the budget, revenues, expenditures, rates, et cetera. And so there's a booklet going around, everybody in the room. Yeah. It's the exact same thing. It's on the screen. And in fairness, the date of this is not a mistake. This is the same that we presented back in October of this year. And again, we just wanted to give you the same information, admittedly, maybe a little repetitive, but sort of set the stage again as you dig into the meat of the budget and individual line items. So we call it multi-year financial plan update. And I think Mr. Dines, if you're driving over there, you can go to the next page. And so again, in terms of the introduction, this really dates back to 2019. So if you remember back in 2019, those of you that are on the board, whether it be the Service Authority or the Board of Supervisors, at that time, really working through the Service Authority and getting ourselves reset, if you will. Back at that time period, had worked through the consent order, some of the various regulatory issues and things that were a problem, had identified as part of that a variety of capital projects that were required, that's my term, required, but basically required for upkeep, maintenance, and regulatory requirements tied to the water and sewer system. So the thought back in 2019 was, okay, what is the way or ways that we can make sure that the authority continues to build upon its financial strength, continues to be self-supporting. We talk about that a lot, and we'll talk about why that's important. Continues to be able to make the needed capital investments. And that was a big piece of what was done in 2019 and still is a big topic today is, okay, how do we make sure we're able to make the capital investments in the utility for both regulatory reasons, for reliability reasons, for water quality reasons, and even at some level for operational savings reasons. As we talk about sort of taking some of these plants offline, there's actually dollars to be saved by virtue of investing in the capital infrastructure. And so that was a big component of what was done back in 2019 to get this moving. All of that, sort of one of the major variables, if you look in the middle of the screen there, was putting in place a multi-year plan. So if you recall back in 2019, things were a little dire from the operational side. We knew we had to make some major investments, and the thought was, how do we give ourselves a predictable year-over-year path to get ourselves to a point where we can make these investments, continue to be self-supporting in terms of the utility paying for itself to the greatest extent possible, and give the users of the system some visibility and predictability as to what those rates would be in the future. And so all of that was in summary kind of part and parcel in what was done in 2019. And so We fast forward a little bit. It's right now somehow 2022. We're talking about fiscal year 2023. We've obviously had a pandemic in the middle of that. We've had some inflationary pressures. We've had some stimulus funds, et cetera. So we got a bunch of variables out there right now. But at the core of it remains this plan to take the existing utility, and I think that's kind of the way I think about it. Take what we have in the ground right now, and make sure that from a financial standpoint, it can stand on its own. It's not draining the resources from the general fund. We know that on the general fund side of the equation, there are big needs of the capital variety, of the operational variety. And so we talk a lot about why is it important to have a self-supporting utility system. One of those major reasons is to make sure we're insulating the general fund from the costs of the utility, because we know that on the general fund side, there's a whole variety of capital costs, there's operational costs, the schools, et cetera. And so that's a critical component of all of this, even though the general fund isn't per se a discussion topic tonight. So with that as sort of the introduction there, that really was set up in 2019. We now fast forward to 2022. So if we go to page number 2, Mr. Dines. So the back there, self-supporting, I won't explain that again. I think we've talked a lot about that, why it's important. But the fact is that it is a industry best practice, and it also, knowing the pressures and the challenges that we, like every other local government, have on the general fund side of things, it is doing what we can to help insulate and support the financial strength of the general fund. So again, we list the reasons why that self-supporting nature is important in terms of working with the existing infrastructure that we have on the ground, the existing financial structure that we have. And so I won't read over that word by word. We've talked about that multiple times. So that gets us to page number 3 in terms of the goals and objectives. So what were we doing back in October? Really updating that multi-year plan. It had been about 2 years since it had been refreshed. Continued to think about ways that, as we're talking about rate increases, as we're talking about the need to have revenues continue to increase to help offset both the inflationary costs and the capital costs, that we can do so in a moderated way. So we're not having big rate increases year over year, but try and moderate things year over year so there's some predictability to it. And that's one of the goals. Want to make sure in number 3, we've got some flexibility here. We know that conditions on the ground, so to speak, continue to change. We know the capital costs increase on one side, but we also know that there is some federal money and state money out there on the other side. And so making sure we've got some of that flexibility in terms of evolving on this as we have new information. And then lastly, down at the bottom there, we talk about identify strategies that allow the service authority to spread the capital cost over time. And so we'll look in here at the debt that is associated with the service authority. It tends to be a hot topic. We understand that. We know that. And I think it's important to take a step back as you think about the debt that is associated with the utility and say, all right, why is that there? Well, it's really there because at some point in time, we either had to buy the system or make improvements to the system. And the way that was done in part over time is to finance it over a long time period. No different than if you have a house or you've had a house with a mortgage, very few people go and pay cash for their house. It just isn't economically feasible to be able to do that. And so the way you do that in the house example is to take out a mortgage, and that home is going to be an asset for you for a long time period. The mortgage is paid over 20 or 30 years as you're enjoying and using the asset. Very similar concept when we think about the debt of the service authority. So that's what we mean when we say set up a situation whereby users of the system can pay for the system over time. That's really what that debt component allows a utility to do. So that goes to page number 4 then, I think, Mr. Dines, in terms of the historical cash flows, just to give a little bit of a visual picture of where we were at the time. I think that graph in the middle hopefully visually paints the picture. With the yellow line as the revenues, and you can see how it did grow from about 4.6 million to about $7 million in 2020. It was some nice growth. But during that 2014 to 2019 period, our expenditures were growing as well, the operational side and the debt service side. So a part of what was done, a critical component of what was done in 2019 was to kind of get ourselves a reset such that visually the yellow line is above the green bars, meaning our revenues are exceeding our expenditures by a much wider margin, build some more cushion and capacity into the cash flows of the system so that we have a greater ability to take on some of these new operational costs, take on some of the new capital costs. That green highlighted box there continues to be a important and really, really critical variable for the utility, and that's the new connection or new growth related revenue. That's been a major component of your revenues for years. We expect it will continue to be into the future. We highlighted there, upwards of 20% of your total revenues are tied to new connections of one variety or another, whether it's homes or whether it's some commercial connections in recent years. That's something we watch very closely. They're much harder to predict, as we all know. It's going to depend upon the economy. It's going to depend upon what new developments end up coming to the county or don't come to the county. And so we always watch that cautiously. And some of our planning and updates in here take that into account, meaning if indeed the new connection and the new growth slows down in the future, what does that look like? So if we move to page 5, another critical component is what are our reserve levels? What is our, in a utility context, we call this days cash on hand, but what really is our reserve? So on the general fund side, we talk about our fund balance and how important that is to the operations of the county, as well as the underlying credit ratings, and our ability to finance things at the lowest cost possible when we need to do so. Similar concept on the utility side, and we call that days cash on hand. You can see that trend on the left hand. It kind of jumped up a fair amount in 2015 and then was gradually being eroded from 2015 to 2019. And then we get to 2020, the first year of, call it the new plan. And we've got a nice tick up in cash and equivalents. And so that's on purpose. That's not an accident. It's not per se extra dollars. We know that at the same time as that cash goes up, we also have big capital investments we need to make. And so what that cash allows us to do is have more contingency against the fact that as we make these capital investments, we don't know the ultimate cost of them. There's going to be other surprises, good or bad, over time. And so as we're making these investments in the capital side, we like to make sure we've got a good, healthy cash contingency, and that's in that days cash on hand. And so that was planned for and contemplated in the plan going back a couple of years. Page 6, the debt service coverage ratio. So this is a specific financial covenant of basically our only lender, which is the Virginia Resources Authority, the VRA. And what it basically says is we need to have $1.15 for every dollar of debt service in each and every year. That's a pretty typical covenant, if you will, or requirement in utility finance. What it does is it sort of puts in place an annual contingency so that if for some reason your revenues are below where you think they're going to be, you have like a 15% contingency to make sure you can cover all your debt service payments. The other thing it does is it builds some more capacity to cash fund capital. And so if we know that in a given year we're able to meet that 115, that's what we call 115 coverage, we've got 15 cents on the dollar that is available to help cash fund capital in the future. So we're not solely reliant on debt in the future. And so we'll flip through the next couple of pages. We'll talk about what was in there in the capital program. It did not rely and doesn't rely solely on borrowing. There's a component of this whereby we are borrowing for a portion of it, but we're also paying cash for a portion of it. So we're trying to have that debt versus equity mixture in the capital program going forward, similar to, you know, if you go buy a house and a lender wants you to put 20% down, that same general concept, wanting to make sure we've got some dollars that can help cash fund as well as borrow for capital in the future. So page 7. So this is our existing service authority debt. So this is after the refunding and restructuring that was done in 2019. Total outstanding debt right now equals about $23.6 million. You can see the payments, 22 through 2024 is about $1.4 million. I'm going to round call it about $1.5 million order of magnitude. We know that's the case for 23, which we're finishing now, which is we're leading into 23, 24, and then it starts to move back up into 25 and 26. No surprise, that was always built into the numbers. And that's basically what we have on the books right now. If we needed to do, if we wanted to do something different with this in terms of the structure, we have that ability. We haven't quite gone all the way down that path yet, but that is a possibility in the short run here. I will say that's not really going to impact any material way in next year's budget. But if you look at that kind of visual there, you go from 25 to 26 to 27. So some of those out year projections, you think about what do the next 2, 3, 5, 7 years look like. One component or one variable we have at our disposal, not to say we need to go race and do this right now per se, but we could look at restructuring, reworking some of that to the extent the need is there. Sir. Hit the button.
You want me to just talk loud, Chris?
Here, this one's working.
Thank you. So some things were brought to light as I've been following this from home, a lot of grant opportunities that previously wasn't out there for us. So looking at this matrix right now on the Service Authority debt service that's up there now, with some things that were planned that we, or the board previously thought they were going to have to look into their operating fund or maybe pulling a bond, since these grants are now made available to them, and they're going to fund some of those things, is there a way that some of the dollars that we were looking at putting off towards those projects could be used to make, let's say, a lump sum payment to the principal, which over years would free up cash flow in your operating fund, so it wouldn't necessarily be going to debt service, but it'd be cash flow available within your operating fund over years. Something similar to what the county did, I believe it was 2019, with the debt mitigation plan. If you follow where I'm going with it, is that within the realm of possibility?
Yeah,
and would it be advantageous?
So it's within the realm of possibilities. It's a good question, Mr. Bush. It's within the realm of possibilities, I think. So what we know right now is, like, we've gotten some grant dollars that weren't expected, which is awesome, towards capital costs. Those are going to be, I expect, and I'll look at Chris here for a moment, but those will be very specific in terms of what we can use those towards. It's going to be capital only. It almost certainly can't be used, directly to go pay down existing debt. But to your point, what it could do, and what it probably will do, frees up other dollars. And so I think what we've been thinking about is we have all these different variables, because we know we've got more grant dollars. We know that we have our existing debt profile is a variable. We know that we had planned to borrow new dollars, but we've got this line of credit, right? That would basically, to my knowledge, drawn almost nothing on. And so you think about those three variables. We've got existing debt, we've got a new line of credit that we haven't really touched yet, in fairness, because these projects haven't gone very far. And then we also have, to our benefit, some new grant dollars that have come in. And so where the grant dollars flow in terms of Do we use that to maybe offset some of the new borrowing that we need to do? That's probably the easiest thing to think about, is instead of necessarily having to use all the line of credit like we were planning on, use some of the grant dollars so we're not borrowing new money as much. It might also free up some other cash flow that, to your point, we could use in kind of a general fund like we did on the general fund side, to whether it's a debt mitigation fund or something like that. So I don't know exactly the answer right now, but those are all the kind of the variables that we're thinking about. The flip side of that, though, is we know that the capital costs, no fault of anybody here, are just more expensive than they were a couple of years ago. So we've got, I think, about $18 million in the plan in here. I'll keep my fingers crossed that that's the right number. I'll keep my fingers crossed that that's a lower number. But I think what we also know is that everybody's projects are just costing more than you think.
And that 18 million is, of course, spread out over 5 years. That was adopted by the board back in November. I think the one thing that we got to work with Kyle on is the $5 million grant that we got from VDH, which starts in July, is a cost incurred reimbursement on a cost incurred basis. So we're going to have to expend some of this capital money. And the question then becomes, can we reimburse ourselves with the grant to pay for that? And that's how we're kind of looking at it, is that we might have to tap that line of credit and then, do it all in one way so that we're not stringing out more interest and all that kind of stuff, and then come back in when they reimburse us to pay down that. But I think what you're talking about is a very wise strategy, and I think that the board will definitely, as we start to get into this, look at that, because I think that you're right. There is a windfall that this organization is getting. Potentially, we hope the other grant that is possibly coming, which is a couple years down the road, is in the second biennial. That could be something that really helps relieve a lot of the two of the major projects that we have on the wastewater side, which are the decommissioning of Perkins and the decommissioning of Oakland Park. And those total about $11 million, just the two of those projects. And so that's a really big windfall that this organization could benefit from. So I do think that what you're saying is something that they'll have as a policy discussion. How can you deal with that? How can you inject that back into your, like you said, pay off debt, or is that something that can be done with ratepayers? That's an option that I think would have to be looked at.
So thank you very much for addressing that. And I brought that up because if you, and I, in all transparency, I am not a customer of the service authority. I have my own well and septic. But from engagement and friends and neighbors that are customers, the biggest thing that they're constantly complaining about is the debt service charge on their monthly bills. So something that could directly impact that and maybe alleviate that debt service, would be a benefit to those customers that they could see in their monthly bills. So thank you very much.
I would add, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think obviously we're not taking out loans is one of the big things that'll help not increase debt, not increase payments that the customers have to make. But looking at it, when Oakland Park and Perkins Corner come offline, they're assuming growth is within what estimates are, and fees and whatnot don't go up for chemicals too much. There'll be money freed up from operations that could then be used to pay down the debt service more quickly. I think that's where you'd see maybe the debt service coming off more quickly, is that extra cash after things have been repaired, more than, and then not having to take out loans that are just going to add more debt service on top of stuff. I think.
Yeah, I think all that's valid, and I think the way those variables play out, we'll just kind of have to see a little bit over the next couple of years. As we know, we've got the grant dollars, hopefully some other grant dollars. We'll be refreshing this from time to time as y'all want us to, if you want us to, all that kind of good stuff. But again, I think the other important point too, and maybe for the customers too, is the other thing that that we try and at least look at, and the policy makers, but what's the aggregate bill to the end user? I know it gets broken down amongst the various components, but the bottom line bill, whether they're paying for debt service or usage or a fixed charge or whatever it is, we tend to, as we're doing these, try and watch that bottom line bill as well. We understand the different line items and different components, but understand how can we get that bottom line bill, whether it's for water, sewer, or both, to be as low as we responsibly can within all the various capital and operational requirements that you have to take care of.
Any more questions?
So I think that takes us to page 8. So again, in terms of the CIP, it's a big component of the service authority's utility or planning. It's really a big component of any water and sewer utilities plan. So the King George County Service Authority is not particularly unique in that sense. Running a water and sewer utility business is a big capital intensive business. And we've talked about this. You've got a lot of pipes, you've got pumps, you've got trucks, you've got a lot of infrastructure that needs to be put in the ground and maintained, et cetera, et cetera. So as we talk about the capital needs that need to be made, you're not alone in having to make these capital needs. Every other water utility essentially across the country is having to deal with the same thing. So in 2019, top of the page there was $15 million. It was identified in terms of capital investments. That was over basically a 5-year period. We've talked about the fact that many of those are, in essence, if not directly, regulatory mandated. Back in the original 2019 plan, the thought was if we did about 75% debt and about 25% cash in terms of funding that over that time period. That was the original plan. As we worked through this last fall, that 15 million of capital had grown to 18 or 19 million. And that's just a byproduct. Again, we're not the engineers or the consultants in that way, but we see this across the industry. Capital is just getting more expensive to do. I think that's not going to be a surprise to anybody. And so we've built the numbers that we were given into the model for that. So going forward, the plan at the time was we've got our $15 million line of credit that in essence we've hardly touched. I think almost nothing's outstanding on it. We know we're trying to build in as much cash flow as we can without raising rates any more than is needed to have recurring cash so we can cash fund some things that isn't going to be reliant upon debt. And so those were the variables at the time. We now know that we've got a $5 million grant. That's only going to be helpful to it. And so those are kind of the big critical pieces. So if we go to page 9, just laying out that $18 million, the projection of how it was going to be spent over a 5-year period. I think, the $3 million in 2022, I suspect it's a lot slower than that. I'll look around, but so this probably just gets shifted out a little bit further. That'll help this year's cash flows, but still needs to be factored in going forward. So order of magnitude, we're in and around that $18.3 million range. Importantly, it's spent over time. Something we tend to see a lot in utility planning is you look at a project and say, all right, Perkins Corner wastewater treatment plant decommissioning costs $3.6 million. Let's stick it all in the budget all in 1 year. The reality is you don't need that all in 1 year. It takes time to get that project designed and built, et cetera. And so we want to try and match the timing of when the funding is available pretty close to when it's actually going to be needed. And so, Mr. Bush.
With that, also relative to that is that cost and interest rate, cost of materials are also increasing at the same time too. Mm-hmm. So while you might not be blocking it out up front, your initial cost estimate is going to be insufficient a year, 2 years down the road. So looking at this right now, this chart goes out to 2026. And given the level of what you're looking at, I would say there's great potential for that to increase by at least $3 million, which will put you somewhere over 21 million vice the 18.3 that we're looking at right now. So just something else to keep in mind as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's why it's fluid. It is the environment that we're in, and so it's a good point. So that was what was modeled at the time, 18.3 million, et cetera. So then we go, I think we just flip ahead to page 11. Okay, we won't read this word for word, but again, the idea is, and really the requirement the VRA had on us was to make sure we've got a multi-year plan. So the board, meaning the Service Authority board back in 2019, approved this plan, and that was part and parcel of VRA's approval of the restructuring that has helped the cash flows the last couple of years. So it's a multi-year plan. Again, trying to do incremental annual rate increases, knowing that the conditions are going to evolve, trying to make sure that we can, to the greatest extent possible, mitigate what needs to be done in terms of user rates. Make sure we're maintaining good cash. We talked about that, and so that's factored into the planning projections. Make sure we've got, just like any good business, you want to make sure you've got some liquidity, sort of built into the system for surprises. Maintaining at least 115 debt service coverage. And that's not on the high side. So that's really shooting for something that would be a basically a requirement of VRA. And again, gives us that 15 cents on the dollar additional. And then lastly, we did take a stab, although I do want to update these numbers, of what would look like if we did rework some of the existing debt. Okay, so we've got a variety of key assumptions. Again, this is going back to the October timeframe, really based off the 2022 budget. We'd want to update this for 2023, and really just kind of building in some assumptions going forward. So these order of magnitude, maybe do some updating with the 2023 budget, but I think all still basically valid for planning purposes. Page 13, we get to some of these other key assumptions. So within this plan, we had the $15 million line of credit. We still have that. The thought was at the end of that time period, we'd term that $15 million out with a long-term permanent loan. As we update all these things, to the extent that the grant money comes in, that other grant monies come in, we may not have to do that. That will just help the out-year cash flow. So that's one of those variables we're going to think about and plan on is how do we think about the mixture of cash-funded capital versus maybe reworking some of the existing debt versus how does the grant funding kind of flow in to mitigate those things. So again, you see some of the financial benchmarks there at the bottom. I think if we go right to page number 14, we'll give you a visual. So again, taking the revenues and expenditures and projecting them out over basically the next 6 years, 2022 plus 5 years. And given the assumptions at the time, what the plan looked like was doing about 73% debt funding, about 17% cash funding. That's over time. It ends up being about $13.7 million in borrowing, $5.1 million in cash. With the rate increases that we'll see on the next page, with the growth assumptions you see on the next page, what you see is that kind of brown line stays pretty solidly above the expenditures for 2022 through 2025. When we get past 2025, which is a fair amount of years out, we want to keep an eye on that. A couple things within the model for the moment are going on. Number one, our existing debt service starts to go back up. It's not going back up quite yet, but it'll start to go back up out in 25 and 26. And we also reduced the assumption in terms of number of new connections when we got into 25 and 26. You've been running pretty well in terms of new connections, both the residential side and the commercial side. I think last information I have is we want to make sure that we're being cautious about what that level of new connection is going forward, because we don't have great visibility in terms of how many new units, whether it's residential, commercial, et cetera. So we kind of tamp down the expectations in the modeling when we get out into 25 and 26. And so what happens is out in those years, just visually, you see the green bars, which is the expenditure side, start to run into and go through the revenue side, which tells us that we need to keep a close eye on that. And again, as part of the update here, think about ways that we can start to mitigate and plan for what happens, A, when the debt service goes back up, whether it's existing debt service or with a new debt service, and B, if growth does indeed tail off at some point. Those are the things we're starting to think about, but it's a couple years out at this point. So page 15 just gives you Ms. Bush.
I'm sorry, I missed the microphone. So you bring up a good point on that. So connection fees, I think it's very dangerous to rely on connection fees in a budget. And this is why it kind of links to a Ponzi scheme. Every major public utility in the country basically relies on that. You know, you put these connection fees in your budget, and that's what you're basing your budget on. But eventually, when growth stops, well, you still have to maintain that. So I would look at it more from an aspect of reoccurring customers, so that are paying those bills, you know, monthly, they're reoccurring. That one-time connection fee, if that's what you're relying on when growth inevitably stops, or if the economy takes a dive and people don't want to build in King George for, let's say, a period of 4 or 5 years, but that's what you've been basing your budget projections on, it can really put you in a tight spot. So that's why I've always been leery about having those connection fees be a critical part of the overall budget. And in past years, it has been. I mean, previous boards have been briefed on, we've had these many connection fees this month, we project this many next month, and so on throughout the fiscal year. But if that doesn't come to fruition, it could really put you in a tight spot, you know, especially with such a limited customer base that you can fall back on.
Yeah, it's a fair point. It's why we've done what we've done in these projections thus far, is to, I think what's built in these thus far is the assumption that like a hop yard builds out and then there's really nothing beyond that. And so I think in talking with staff going back last summer, felt pretty good about the fact that hop yard would build out over a multi-year time period, but then beyond that, we don't know per se. And so that's in essence what we've tried to at least capture in indeed the model. So you're right in that connection fees, they're A, hard to predict. B, even if they do, you know, kind of show up on a plan, when exactly they're going to come in is not known. And so we've, tried to think about that and tried to plan around that. The flip side of that is if you don't rely on connection fees, you still have the same costs in your budget. And so your revenue's got to come from somewhere. And, you know, the other place where it comes from is on the users. And so trying to strike that balance of getting away from relying too much on the connection fee side of things. But if you were to take it to the extreme, if you were to bank on $0 in the budget from connection fees, you got to come up with that revenue from somewhere. And the place where you find that revenue is on the recurring user side of things. And so trying to strike that balance is another part of, you know, kind of the challenge as a growing utility in a growing county. You're kind of in that growth, growth phase. You're a whole lot bigger than you used to be, but you're still not real big. And so it's a question of how do you manage that time period between sort of the phases of the scale of the utility getting bigger. It may take a long time, and so that's why you kind of constantly update these things. You can be. You certainly can. Yep. Okay, so I think then on page 15, going to page 16, the observations, basically keeping with the plan that was adopted would be, again, our recommendation and really what VRA as our only lender wants to make sure we do. Keeping an eye on the growth side of things to the point we just had. That is a important variable. It's a risk factor to the extent that That doesn't come to fruition. And the flip side of that is given your location where you are with 301 and everything else, you would expect that King George would continue to grow at a pace that, you know, the county as a board and et cetera deems appropriate. And so we don't see this as a dire or grim, but certainly we're kind of in an in-between phase where we're monitoring this, we're evaluating it as the variables evolve, and just want to make sure, I think we reiterate those things as we work through. We did in this back in October analysis look at what happens if we did a restructuring of the authority's debt. These are a little bit stale in terms of the numbers, but just to give you an order of magnitude, if you go to page 17, you just look at that visually, you get out to 26 and 27, and basically we're able to cash flow it at that point. There's a lot of additional detail and work that would go into that before you'd kind of make that decision to do that, but it is a variable that we have and continues to be something we could look at. But we would like to take, again, I think, a fresh look with the $5 million with an update on the capital plan and see how we kind of work those variables, again, for all the different goals we talked about.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question. So the small print down here where it says projections assume the annual rate is going to increase by 4% beginning fiscal year 2028. Is that where if it doesn't restructure here, is it saying that every year afterwards it would be, you're projecting 4%?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And it's a great point to bring up. So we get that question a lot anywhere. And I think, especially given where we are right now with inflation, we keep using that term, but it's real. The expectation that utility rates, no different than your cell phone bill, no different than you know, your cable bill, et cetera, as inflation makes the cost of doing things more expensive, you need to make sure that your revenues keep pace with that. And so it's very typical to see an assumption that in the out years, you'll need to make sure you keep pace with the rising cost of doing business. It's frankly, it's unrealistic to think that at any point, if you're going to have a utility system, that your rates are just going to be capped out at some point. There may be some local governments that can do that for a little while. That doesn't usually end well. It usually ends in you know, some level of underinvestment in the system and or a need to have a big spike in rates once it kind of catches up with you. So it's a good point. But again, trying to be as realistic as you can when you do these projections and understand that whether it's 8.5% inflation today or the 2 to 3% inflation we had for a bunch of years going back a decade ago, the cost of doing business for this business or any other business, you just need to expect that it's going to continue to rise in the future.
Let me ask you another question. So I'm looking at page 18 and it says the increase in user revenue. So over the 5-year plan, the increase has been 4%, 3%, and then 4% in 2025, 4% in 2026, 4% in 2027. Mm-hmm. So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding. So then it would continue at 4% going forward. So the reason why I'm saying this is because this was a 5-year plan. Mm-hmm. And to me, it looks like it's just going to continue to go on. It's not going to stop, right?
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that you like to project for like a 5-year time period. Anything you can project longer than that. Anything longer than that the horizon tends to get out so far that the numbers mean less and less the further you go out. And so it is a 5-year plan that assumes that, but I think it's important to note that when you get to year 2028, that just doesn't happen to appear on this graph. You'll continue to have a utility system that'll need to be run. There will be operational costs. There will be capital costs. And so, you'll need to continue to fund those into the future. So it's a perpetual entity, right? It's going to be around for essentially forever.
And I
Yeah.
think what Kyle is also saying is that, once we maybe get a year on down the road, we can look at this plan and develop a new plan, and it would have the other aspects of the possible revenue sources coming in, the two grants, and how do they factor in, and what does that mean? Is, like Mr. Bush is saying, how do you account for that? Is there a way to take off debt? Is there a way to, not have as high of a rate increase as 4% 1 year, or, to give rate, to give the user some, some leeway 1 year or 2 years. Those are things that we can explore. But I think, as you said, you need to have some kind of assumption that you're going to have some kind of an annual increase.
So as much as I like to bash the service authority on their rates, I do agree with the way the plan is structured, because one, you're being transparent, you're putting it out there and telling the customers, hey, you can expect this 4%, but like you do every year, the board gets together and assesses their financial situation. I know when within this past year, just look at the cost of materials and labor right now. So if you have somebody that bid to build, let's say, a back deck at your house, you got one price. That could have fluctuated, depending on the size, $3,000 or $4,000 within a 3-month period because of the availability of materials and the labor. So I think at least having that 4% in there is actually a good thing. So just wanted to share that.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I think you bring up a great point too, and then it's looked at annually. So, Mr. Bush, I think your point is spot on, which is you want to get a plan that's set up so it's transparent. Folks know kind of what's being done to plan for a multi-year period. I mean, we're not experts in running utility, but what this would say to me if I were a customer, and I'll give you a corollary here in a second, is that the authority is planning on making investments in the infrastructure so that the reliability and the quality and those kind of things of the water is going to be the way that I expected. So I live in Henrico County. Henrico's got a very large AAA rated water and sewer utility. They raise rates every year like clockwork. And in fairness, they don't probably really need to raise rates every single year like clockwork, but it is a very well run, runs like a top kind of utility. And so what that allows them to do is some years they have better years than others. Some years growth is greater than others. Some years they're able to cash fund some more capital. They have to borrow for some things occasionally. But it is sort of, you term like clockwork, 3, 4, 5% a year, boom, 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 boom. A couple of years, maybe a little bit less, but each and every year there's an annual adjustment. And at some level, it's just a realization that the cost of doing business, if the overall economy over the long time period is growing, maybe not each and every year, but over the long time period is growing, you need to expect that your revenues need to keep pace with that. And that's the way a utility does that. So that's probably more than maybe you were looking for, but I just thought that was a good point. That's accurate. That is a much larger customer base. And so, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to answer any other questions or et cetera.
Anybody have any questions? All right. Thank you, Kyle. And we'll turn this over to Mr. Miller for the fiscal year 2022-23 revenue projections.
Okay, so Ms. Hahn has put together some preliminary revenue projections for your perusal tonight, and so we'll let Ms. Hahn go ahead and walk you through it.
So this spreadsheet that you have in front of you is the same as you get every year with the proposed option for fiscal year 2022-2023. And the numbers that you see in that column are built on the rate plan that was approved in fiscal year, back in 2019 with the 4% increase for fiscal year 2022-2023. So each one of those has increased by 4%. And so I don't know if you need me to go over each line or if you want to look at it, have any questions.
Mr. Chair, I have one question. is on the, and Mr. Miller, you probably have to answer this, the tower lease fee, is KGI still leasing our towers?
Yes, they still are. And then we get other companies interested, and we'll sit down and talk to them, and, you know, they want to put a tower up, or I mean, put a little antenna up, and so we work with anybody, get a little lease money out of it.
Okay, so this is accurate. I just wanted to make sure.
The lease payments are coming in on a monthly basis.
All right, thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, can I ask a question, Mr. Chair?
Go ahead.
So what is the water operator fees schools? There wasn't any for several years. Then it was in there for $7,000 this year, and now it's back down to zero for a delta of negative 7,000. What was that?
Do you want to answer that?
Thank you.
The Service Authority operates the wells at the schools, at the school board office and the old middle school, which no longer we operate that. We were trying to negotiate during that time for them to pay us to do that. They do pay for any upgrades or testing, but they had to have an operator with a licensing, which we provided, and we maintained their permit that way.
So you politely said we were trying to negotiate.
We were trying to.
So that
it started
didn't pan out.
many years ago with the superintendent of the schools, Miss Candace Brown, and it never was resolved. But we did continue to operate the wells for them.
Okay, thank you.
He's got it.
And it was in there for several years, but every year it was 7,000 budgeted, but $0
was
came in.
recouped.
So
Okay.
when I asked Ms. Barker what it was, and she explained it to me, I went ahead and took it out. Since
Okay.
we're not, unless you all.
If you're not, you don't want to use that as a revenue source if you're not ever going to collect it.
Sure. Mr. Chair, may I ask another question
Yes, ma'am.
unrelated to that? Under miscellaneous revenue, miscellaneous income tracked for a few years was rather large the year before. And then it's been zero and zero proposed. What was that? What constitutes
So the bottom line,
miscellaneous income?
Are you referring to that 171,000?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have, were you able to get into AS 400?
Ms. Cobb is going to look in AS 400 and see where that came from. I'm thinking that part of that was insurance payments. That much of one?
I had one of $50,000.
So we
So like
made claims on our insurance policy.
if we have damages on a
Okay.
vehicle, just the same on the county side, when the insurance claim is paid out, it comes back in under miscellaneous revenue.
Okay, thank you.
Could that also be from the care funds that were given to people? Because I see that there's a zero in penalties for that year.
So during COVID, we didn't charge any penalties or late fees. And then the funds that you're referring to, they came in as a revenue, and that revenue for those, we had to take the bills from the customers and come up with the amount of revenue that we would have gotten if the bills were actually paid, and offset it there, as well as the accounts receivable. And I wasn't involved when muni billing first came in, and how all the coding for the revenues that come in are coded through muni billing and going directly to the treasurer's office, but we are capturing revenue at the time a bill is generated. And so actually, if people weren't paying their bills, we really weren't getting that revenue. And so we got the CARES money and offset those revenue accounts there.
And so then it flowed up into the fees then, the water fees. And
Right.
fees. Okay.
Yes.
I have another question too about the penalties. I'm just curious. I saw that it's gone down from last year. So is there any reason because of that?
There's a local emergency. We were not penalizing our customers for being late during the local emergency.
But she's talking about here.
Oh,
And so, and what I did here was the same as what Jonathan had done, because it's hard to guesstimate how much revenue you will generate from penalties. And in the 5-year plan, this bottom line total of the $7.2 million in revenue included penalties, but I lowered it based on the calculations of the other revenue lines and to reach that figure that we should be at for the bottom line.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any other questions?
So before you get to the adjournment, I guess at our next meeting, we will, I had mentioned last week that there were some things that I was still working on the expenditure side. I did have, we've had meetings with both Enterprise Fleet, and I'll need to update that. And I also met yesterday with Verizon Wireless, and we're going to be doing some rate changes on the wireless side of the house on our bills that's going to lower the cost of that. So I'll be updating those and then comparing the revenues to our expenditures and bring back the full sheet like Jonathan brought to you on the meeting number 3 last year.
With that, and I know it's ongoing. Has that study for basically pay rates is it still underway? I mean, that's HR. More asking Mr. Miller on that.
Well, the Board of Supervisors, if we're going to do the same thing with the county, then it makes sense to, piggyback on what the county does. And so the county the county has a work session next Wednesday. And I have no idea if they'll keep that in. At this point, it's in, but they may do some different things. But, and so, yes, we'll have it in there. And
I believe that when the last study was done 5 years ago, the service authority positions were included in that study.
Yeah, I think they're in what Ms. Kupka was indicating. They haven't started. It hasn't been done yet. So, all right. Do I have a motion?
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. So, I had a medical procedure for the last meeting, so I apologize. But I do appreciate y'all forwarding out the expenditures. I had a couple of questions, if that's okay. Okay, so one, is there a breakdown of actual employees instead of just the salary benefits? Is there a breakdown of, say, employee number 1, number 2, number 3, and this is what their salary is, this is their position? Is there an itemized breakdown of that?
yes. Oh.
There is a breakdown that we use, and then
We could give you a position listing. I don't necessarily.
Yeah, I don't need names or anything. I just wanted something that was, comparable that I could look at the actual positions. And so those positions are reflected just in the service authority's budget. There's none, because I know there's a potential merger going on. Those are not currently reflected in the county's proposed budget,
No.
correct? Okay. And then the only other thing I had was, so I was watching online, and it seemed that, so there seems to be 2 different accounting lines. One is for hazardous waste, and then one is for contracted services. So if you had to, let's say you have a pump truck that's hauling from Perkins to Dahlgren, okay, and you wanted to track, all right, this is how much it's costing me over any given year to haul from Perkins to Dahlgren. It seems that it's being broken in between two different accounting lines, hazardous waste and contracted services. Is there a definitive that where, let's say next year's budget, if you're hauling from any given pump station or facility to, let's say, Dahlgren, that it's going to be in one accounting line, or is it going to be in two? And how is that reflected in the proposed budget?
What line item are you referring to for hazardous waste?
So there was talk about there's an accounting line for contracted services, and then there's an accounting line for hazardous waste, so that if you had to remove stuff to bring it to the landfill, I was just curious. So if looking at it, you know, if you had, say, we had to haul this much from point A to point B, this is how much it cost. Would it be tracked under one line item, or would it be tracked between the contracted services and then some in the hazardous waste to where it's broken up? Or is there one distinct line item that it could be traced to?
We
First
have,
of all, I don't know, we're not doing hazardous waste.
no.
So I think, are you
Okay.
talking about wastewater? Sludge? Are you talking about sludge? Right.
Yes.
Okay, that's, I want to be.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Hazardous
Yes.
waste is making me think that we need hazmat suits, but
No.
no, we do sludge removal, obviously, and when we have an employee, that is his responsibility, and he does that every day, every week, to take the sludge from the 4 plants and hauls that to Dahlgren. He doesn't, well, and then that stuff is run through a belt press that kind of dewaters it, and then that stuff is ultimately hauled to the landfill, and that is either hauled by, I assume, by Latif. Oh, it's by Waste Management, and we have had some circumstances where local was involved in hauling away the trash cans, so that's going to be in the contract services if we had to use another company to come in, and help us out. And so that did happen, in fact, at Perkins over the course of, I think it was early in March, or maybe it was late February. They had to get rid of some sludge that was causing issues with possible overflows. And so we did have contract employees that we had assisting our own individual employees that were moving that out. So that would be included in a contract services cost for that. The regular sludge removal would be handled. I don't think we factor that out. I mean, that's what he does. So
if you're using any contracted services, it's going to be under that contracted services.
but it would also be a
category.
contract service for if you had a water leak. That's going to probably fall under that. But that would be on the water side expenses. And then, but the wastewater side would be the sludge removal would be, if you had a contract service, that would be in that area.
Okay. And then last question, I promise. So in Bowdoin, is there anywhere where you could see what the total cost is for an annual contracted service from in Bowdoin?
So we have provided that information to the board on a monthly basis.
Okay.
And their contract obviously went way up beginning in January, the end of January, when we had the issues.
So it's reoccurring. It's not a fixed annual contract. It's
And they had a 6-month contract to begin with that was about $4,800, I think, per month, just to do the reporting that where they would come in, and they would come in twice a month, and they would do reporting. And then once I escalated their role, because we needed the expertise to help operate the plants, that went up significantly. And I think we have had, I haven't seen the latest one, but I know we were in the 30 to 40,000 range, but that has leveled off because they're not as involved right now in our operations. They're still guiding, but they're not in there 24/7 doing the things that they needed to do. So it was the end of January, the February, and probably the early part of March was the most intensive portion, and we have provided that information to the board. I'm happy to provide that information as well.
And I only bring that up because I'm trying to see if, are they a sole source provider, or are they getting close to that $50,000 threshold where they
So
need to be?
what happened on that,
multiple
Mr. Bush, is when Mr. Weekly was leaving, the board approved an emergency contract with them to serve as the operator and responsible charge because they held the Class 1 license. He had a Class, yes, sir. He had a Class 1 license, and so when he left, he got them to do it. And initially, the plan was they were just going to come in, do their thing every 2 weeks, and, you know, be there for training, be there for advice, be those kind of things. And then that was a 6-month contract, and we are in the second 6-month contract. They had under their original contract, it goes on a monthly basis. And so they're in, I guess, month 3 of the second 6 months, and it will expire at the end of August. That's the end of it. I mean, basically, we are at the end of that in August. And so what the board has asked us to do was to issue an RFQ, a request for qualifications, to among a lot of operators as the possibility of coming in as being a contract operator or a manager of our wastewater. And at this point, we're just it'll be May 2nd.
May 2nd, it closes.
May 2nd is
Okay.
when that closes. And we'll be in a position to discuss and to bring to the board the terms or the possible proposal and see which way the board wants to go.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions? I'll entertain a motion then.
Move to adjourn to April 27th, 2022. Will we be?
No, 28.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's just,
You got
okay.
the
So
wrong
it's the
one. You got the
28th,
wrong board.
April 28th. Oh, yeah. Gotcha. Now I'm tracking. This body adjourned to April 28th, 2022. Are we again 5:30 here in the sheriff's office?
We can be, or we could be at the boardroom. I don't know. What we can, I don't, TBD.
Okay, then I'll move to adjourn to April 28th, 2022 at a location to be determined.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, we have a motion that's been seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. We're adjourned.